Many know of the Stephen Covey's 7 Habits of Highly Effective People. Yet today, I am here to share with you the world's most ancient and most effective habits of highly successful communicators. How to convey a message, how to get people to listen to you, how to get children interested in what's going on around the Shabbat table, how to market to customers who seem disinterested in your product, how to pitch investors on your great new idea, how to communicate your organization, your mission, and your goals to raise funds, or how to convey an idea to your congregation, or simply how to speak to your spouse and children. This week, we receive the keys to effective communications from the greatest teacher and communicator of all, Moses, known as Moshe Rabbeinu. In this week's Torah portion, the second in the book of Vayikra, in the book of Leviticus, called Tzav, it continues with the main theme of the book, which is to teach us the laws of karbanot, the laws of offerings that were offered on the holy altar in the temple. One of the central groups of karbanot offerings is called in Hebrew the korban todah, the thanksgiving offering. When a person faced a threatening danger and went through it peacefully and successfully, he or she was commanded to celebrate the moment. Don't let that moment pass, but acknowledge, commemorate the kindness with a thank you offering. Today, when there's no physical temple, this korban todah, this offering of acknowledgement, is replaced with a special blessing called hagomel. When we survive a danger, one comes to the synagogue, steps up to the Torah, and recites the hagomel near the Torah scroll, a special blessing of thanksgiving to our Maker. Now, the Torah does not really list a specific case of rescue that requires this offering or blessing of hagomel. Yet our sages of blessed memory derived the moments of thanksgiving from the words of King David in Psalm 107. He says there are 4 kinds of danger that are listed there. And in each of them, David concludes with the refrain, with these words, "They shall give thanks to the Lord for his kindness and for his wonders to the children of men." The first of these, it speaks of one who traversed a wilderness. They strayed in the desert or on a road of desolation. They didn't find an inhabited city. When they made it to safety, they shall give thanks to the Lord for his kindness and for his wonders to the children of men. The second category of acknowledgement of gratitude is it speaks about one who was freed from prison. Those, King David writes, those who sit in darkness and the shadow of death. Prisoners of affliction and iron. When they get out, they shall give thanks to the Lord for his kindness and for his wonders to the children of men. King David speaks of the third category of acknowledging of kindness and gratitude is one who was healed from illness. And he writes, he sent his word and healed them. And he took them out of the pit. They shall give thanks to the Lord, says King David, for his kindness, for his wonders to the children of men. And the fourth category, and the last category in the case is the case of seafarers, those who go down to the sea in ships, who do work in the mighty waters. King David says, they shall give thanks to the Lord for his kindness and for his wonders to the children of men. And as an aside, the holy saintly Hasidic founder, the Baal Shem Tov, instituted the recital of this Psalm 107 every Shabbat evening before the afternoon mincha prayer. Why? This is to thank the Almighty God for all the help and rescue that came during this past week as we begin the Shabbat, just in case, maybe perhaps, we might have taken a moment for granted and forgot to say thank you, God, properly. A simple question arises. King David presented them in the order: one who crosses the desert, one who comes out of prison, one who heals from an illness, and one who crosses the sea. But the commentary on this week's Torah portion changes the order when he talks about this offering of thanksgiving, and he precedes the last before the first. He says, for a miracle that happened to him, one thanks God, for instance, one who crossed the sea, or journeyed in the desert, or had been imprisoned, or had been sick and recovered. All of those are required to give thanks, for regarding them it is written, they shall give thanks to the Lord for his kindness and for his wonders to the children of men. Hey, something's a bit odd here. Why does Rashi precede the seafarers to the desert, to those who cross the desert? King David had a different order. The question is magnified when it says that the reason desert travelers come first in King David's order in the book of Psalms, because at that point in history, that was the most dangerous means of travel. Even more dangerous than traveling on the pirated seas, because the desert was infested with bandits and evil beasts. And thus, it required a blessing when one crossed the desert peacefully and arrived home successfully. Yet, when the commentary Rashi comes to explain this, he changes the order and he says the first person who's to thank is one who crosses the sea. And then he mentions the desert travelers, etc. Why does he change the order? And it's actually worth noticing that the question is especially relevant today. Because today the most commoners who recite the blessing of Hagomel is one who flies over the ocean. If you cross the Atlantic, the Pacific, etc., if you come back home safely, you cross the sea, it's a danger that requires this blessing of Hagomel to thank God that you made it home safely. So therefore, it is actually more interesting to examine why the Rashi begins with those who cross the sea, which, like any flight will attest, it's less dangerous than a cross through the desert. And one more thing. There's another wording in the commentary that stands out and begs for an exploration. Rashi says, such as the seafarers, desert goers, freed prisoners, and a sick patient who was healed. If you noticed, the first three are plural form, while the last one is singular. Why? Friends, the Lubavitcher Rebbe of blessed memory conveyed a most brilliant internal explanation in his teachings in the Likutei Sichos, volume 12 and onwards. And by conveying the greatest secret of the successful sermon, or for the matter, the greatest secret how to be a true communicator that touches the essence of the other. Because while it's quite easy to convey a message, as I'm sharing with you here on YouTube, a message to the mind, it's quite difficult to inspire and ignite the heart. Because any teacher can pass on dry information that will enter the head and sit there until the next test, and then it will be forgotten. But yet very few teachers know how to pierce and shake the listener to the core, to turn that information into a personal message that resonates deeply within the listener and becomes part of him or her, part of their life. You know, Albert Einstein, he once said, education is what remains after one has forgotten what one has learned in school. Because the difference between a teacher and an educator is that a teacher conveys material, whereas an educator, his lessons penetrate the student's mind and pierce the student's heart, assimilating the message within him. A teacher can be forgotten. The impact and influence of a good educator, however, never ends and is everlasting. You know, friends, the secret of a good sermon is to evoke an emotional response, a soulful experience, to draw the information from the world of the intellectual mind to the world of the emotional heart and create personal involvement. You know, as a rabbi, I can tell you that a good sermon excites, it shocks, it comforts, or maybe upsets. The recipient doesn't leave the lecture as he entered, but undergoes an emotional change. Think of a lecturer who faces a crowd of smokers and he's trying to persuade them to stop smoking. What does he do? A bad lecture conveys the information about the dangers of smoking. A good lecture causes fidgeting, discomfort, eliciting feelings, one that will move that person the next time he tries to light a cigarette. As they say, the job of the rabbi is to comfort the afflicted and afflict the comfortable. The job of a sermon is to generate a change in one's emotional state, comforting when that's needed, driving and empowering the recipient to be and to do better when that's required. The method may seem at first glance to be counterintuitive. An effective sermon is much less about the speaker than the listener, much less about the conveyor than the recipient. Because a good sermonizer shouldn't think about what he knows or what touched him, but what his audience knows and what touches them. The great sermonizer doesn't speak to his audiences. He listens to their hearts, to their souls, their needs, their desires, and then he addresses those. Because once the speaker knows his audience, Only then can he link those profound ideas to the listener's place in the world, the complex struggles and challenges that the listener is facing. And that, friends, is the difference between mind and emotion. The mind is curious, the mind is interested, so much so that the mind is willing to hear distant ideas that have nothing to do with it at all. A detailed description of hunting antelopes in Zimbabwe, or surviving space without gravity. Tell me more, says the mind. Emotion, on the other hand, is personal. It's resonant. The heart is the engine of the mind and is aroused only by the realization that these things are related to me. Cigarettes are dangerous to me. They threaten the chances of being healthy at my children's wedding. Only when it's about me does motivation for action arise. And that, friends, is Rashi's simple assertion. Moshe Rabbeinu, Moses, was a great teacher, an amazing educator, more than only a teacher who taught Jewish law. Moses was an educator. He worked to instill in the hearts of his people, to show them how the Torah is theirs. Moses linked his teachings he taught to the experiences the Jewish people thus far had as becoming a nation. As we know, the generation that came out of Egypt and sat at the feet of Moses went through all four kinds of threats themselves that we listed earlier, and exactly in the order mentioned by Rashi. First, they were seafarers. Miraculously, they passed through the splitting of the Red Sea. Then, they entered the Great Desert, spending 40 years. That became the world's largest prison. And then as the Jews prepared to enter the Promised Land, they were finally becoming free from prison. At which point, one could imagine Moses beseeching the people to offer up thanks, like a korban todah, an offering of thanks, or reciting the blessing of Hagomel for crossing the sea, traversing the desert, and as you enter the Promised Land, finally from prison. Now, all of this happens in a very collective ways. That's why it's conveyed in a plural, because that was all the people of Israel. And finally, at the end, Moses adds another rescue case that can happen to an individual personally. A patient who has, God forbid, been sick and now has been healed. And since it only concerns one person, not an experience that happened to everybody, it was brought last in. And this is well understood. Why Rashi, who's documenting Moses' teaching of the collective people, presents the case in singular and last, while the previous ones will present it in a plural form. Friends, the importance of the personal message and how it can accomplish that which all math and science and intellect cannot is captured in this perfect example of a story delivered by one of the greatest preachers of our generation, Rabbi Yisrael Meir Lau, the former chief rabbi of Israel. He says a story that decades ago, Rabbi Lau was invited to attend an interfaith conference in the Netherlands. One of the heavily sensitive issues that has come up on the table is the complex end of life, resuscitate or do not resuscitate issue. And Rabbi Lau, being the great orator he is, he delivered an in-depth, comprehensive sermon covering the many, many nuances, sensitivities, factors in Jewish law, especially emphasized the Jewish message about the deep sensitivity that should accompany and exit and engage the people there in this subject. And he said, this is a slippery slope, the end of which is ours. The role of a doctor is to give life and not to take life. Human beings must not take lightly the question of which life is worthy and which life is not worthy. Measuring the value or quality of life is not our job, nor is it within our finite abilities. And he said the Nazis murdered people with special needs, claiming it a mercy. And there are enlightened states today that allow the shortening of life for patients with severe depression and other mental illnesses, playing God by taking life which they never gave in the first place. Rabbi Lau finished his remarks, and he noticed that some of the participants looking at him with cynicism, and they were mocking. as to say, like, what does the rabbi understand about medical issues? Maybe he goes back to study the Torah. Yet suddenly an elderly doctor stood up in the crowd and he asked for permission to speak. And he said, I heard this rabbi from Jerusalem. I saw the mockery that came over some of the participants here. And I want to tell you a story that I personally experienced when I was a young doctor during my internship. And this elderly doctor says, when he was a young doctor, he was in the emergency room, it was quiet. And he was waiting for this long shift to end so he can go home. And he says, suddenly, paramedics broke into the room with a stretcher, carrying a very serious medical case, one that the doctor really didn't want to see, even after 40 years of experience. Never mind an intern. I was young. It wasn't something I was ready to see. And then what happened was there was an elderly farmer. He was chopping wood. He had a terrible accident. Somehow the axe boomeranged and embedded itself deeply into his skull. And he arrived to the emergency room with an exposed brain. And his condition was critical. Senior doctors began to run inside. The operating theater was quickly prepared. And this, he says, I, the naive intern, was tasked with the impossible job to communicate with the family members. 3 young men came in and introduced themselves as the farmer's children. They pulled back the curtain and they saw their father's dire condition. They huddled for a few moments and then asked to call the medical staff. And the eldest of them said, listen, you can stop caring for Dad. We have come to the unanimous conclusion that Dad has lived enough. The doctor finished his story, and there was silence in the hall. The contrast between the effect his own words had on the conference and those of the doctor struck Rabbi Lau like a bolt. He said 10 speeches full of polemics and footnotes could never compare to one's personal account from the heart as this doctor that just spoke. Friends, the principle is true for each one of us. Whether we are preachers, teachers, rabbis, or doctors, farmers, or parents, or children, or whatever else. Our job and mission in this world is to communicate truth, to communicate light, eternity, to communicate hope, joy, and positivity, each in our own unique way and in our own providential circumstances. But communication doesn't mean conveying information or data like a computer. It means talking to someone from the heart, from your own heart in a way that resonates, that inspires. Hear the message taught by the Rabbi. This rings loud and clear. It doesn't suffice to be a parent who says and announces how to behave. The commandment of education is much more. It is to inspire the child, to sweep him away, to show the child the magic, the wonder, to live it, to breathe it, to be it. And you know, friends, Shabbat meals are prime moments of show and tell education. When we come to the Shabbat table prepared with an exciting Jewish story, or maybe with a description of a personal experience in which the message of the Torah portion ignited us, or an illustration or a translation into the world of a child, you know what happens? The children around the table are transfixed and transformed. They will understand things that speak to them, and the challenges that lie ahead can be addressed personally. Just last week we had Purim, and now we have this Shabbat as a continuation. We are only 3.5 weeks before Passover. The Rebbe he answered a fascinating question about the story of the Exodus and the 4 sons that are invited to the Seder. The Rebbe says, we don't choose our children. Sometimes we have a wise son. Sometimes we have a son who doesn't know how to ask. Yet, the Torah actually says, you are commanded to educate every type of child. The wise, the cynic, the simple, and the ignorant. Even the 5th child who doesn't even show up at all. And interesting, there's a marked change from the way the Torah communicates to each son. A change that is unmistakable. Take a look. When it comes to the innocent son, what does the Torah say? That it will come to pass, if your son asks you in the future, what is this all about? You should tell him, with a mighty hand did God take us out of Egypt, out of the house of slavery and bondage. But what happens when it comes to the son who doesn't even know how to ask? He's not ignorant. He doesn't know what to ask at all. What should you tell him? It says, you shall tell your son on that day, saying, because of this, the Lord did for me when I went out of Egypt. With the ignorant son, the Tom, the innocent son, we should call him, the father is commanded to tell of the glorious departure of the entire people of Egypt, the collective exit. God took us out, all of us out of Egypt. But when it comes to the ignorant, not to the innocent, the one who doesn't even know how to ask, the father says he's commanded to personalize it. This is what God did when he took me out of Egypt. Why the difference? The Rabbi explains, because the innocent son, at least he's showing some interest. What is this all about? What's going on here? Why do we have a Passover Seder? Why is this table set with all these things on it? So it's enough to tell him about the miracle, about the amazing exodus that happened to us as a people, the we. Because when a child is already engaged enough to ask, what is this all about? The personal relevance has already been established. He feels connected. But then when you talk to the son who doesn't even know how to ask, he's so ignorant, he knows nothing. He's not interested in the whole subject of what happened. He really doesn't care about why the table is set and what's going on. All he wants to know is when will this Passover feast will be over so he can go out with friends? So there the Rebbe says it's not about the we. It's not going to be useful to tell him about the miracle that God took us out of Egypt. Because somebody else's collective history doesn't excite this son. It's irrelevant. It's not his story. So how do you captivate this child? The only way to captivate his heart and mind is to translate the story into first-person terms. This is my story. This is my personal experience. So the father says, this is what God did to me when I went out of Egypt. Now, this ignorant son realizes this isn't some piece of history. It's a story that's happening now, to me, in 2024, either in Jerusalem or Tzfat, New York or Nashville, or Russia or Ukraine or anywhere else one may find himself. I conclude with a most beautiful point. You know, what is the most popular Jewish book? It's known the Haggadah. What is the most popular Haggadah? The Maxwell House Haggadah. It has printed over 50 million copies in print. That's about 3 Haggadahs for every Jew that never heard of the word of the Talmud or the Mishnah. These are people who might not, many of them don't even know the Shema or the Manishtana. So what is the secret of the Haggadah that it is the most popular printed book? How and why has it become more popular than any other Jewish book? Friends, the answer is in the name. Haggadah. Haggadah as in, what does it mean? You shall tell. You shall tell your child. Emphasize, tell. Specifically, don't say or speak to your child what happened. Tell them the story. The Onkelos translates, V'higadata, which means you shall experience it, not just tell them. The Seder night isn't a classroom, it's not a lecture, it's not a demonstration, it's an experience that captures the emotion and fills the senses, creating a personal, first-hand connection between the child and the message. That is telling, that is what it means, Haggadah. Tell them, so they shall experience it. Experience it themselves. Because the Haggadah is the only book that the sages teach us this lesson that we do it as a family experience. And it begins with questions. So the children should ask questions and they should get curious. It's in the telling and the experiencing of my story, one that is relevant, one that is personal, actual, ongoing, and eternal. And as the Haggadah opens right after the questions, and it says that even if we were all wise men, all understanding, all elders, all knowing the whole Torah, we would still be commanded to tell the story of the Exodus from Egypt. Why? Because whoever tells about it at length is worthy of praise. Because the telling of a good story never ends. Yet, a good sermon does end. So I end here wishing you, my friends, to experience and to feel a most beautiful, meaningful, uplifting, and inspiring Shabbat with your family at home this weekend. Shabbat Shalom, Yah.